So in this lecture, you're going to learn an easy way of defining parameters right in the URL, how to then read these parameters, and also how to respond to them. Now, what we want to actually implement in this lecture is a way of getting only one tour. So right now we have this endpoint here, which gives us all the tours, and we want to have something like this. So let's copy it into a new request for now, and then we want slash and then the ID of the tour. So for example, let's say 5, okay? So this is just like we talked about in the REST API lecture, where I said that if we hit this endpoint without any ID, so just like this here, well, then we would get all the tours. But if we would specify an ID after that, so just like this, and of course it doesn't have to be an ID, it can be any unique identifier. But in this case, the easiest way of implementing it is to just use IDs. Okay, so this here is of course a variable because it can be 5, but it can also be anything else. And so this piece of the URL here, so this here, this is a variable. Okay, and so what we need to do is to define a route which can accept a variable. All right, and so let's do that here, actually right after this one. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy it because you already know how to write it at this point. And so, yeah, so here we have the route. And so now all we need to do is to add that variable. And that's very easy. So we have our slash again, and then the variable, we define it using a colon like this. And so like this, we created a variable called ID. It could of course be anything else like var or x. Doesn't really matter, but this one is called ID. All right, now we don't want to send back anything like this, so let's just comment it out. And what I want you to take a look at is at console.log rec.params. Okay, so request.params is where all the parameters, or all the variables that we define here are stored. Okay, so these variables here in the URL are called parameters. And again, they are in rec.params available for us to use them. So let's take a look now and actually do this request. And for now, it's not going to do anything. So it will not give us tour number 5 automatically, of course. But what I want to do for now is to just take a look at rec.params. And so indeed, here we have ID is 5. So request.params is a very nice object which automatically assigns the value to our variable. So our parameter that we defined. And we could actually define multiple. So we could say ID, and then we could say X, and we could say Y. And then we, of course, would have to define all of them. So 23 and 45, let's say, send this guy. And then indeed, we have an object with all these 3 variables in them. Okay. Now, if we define them like this in the URL, we actually have to then specify them. So if we didn't have the Y parameter, we would run into an error because we are now not hitting this exact route. Okay, so our route is now no longer exactly this, but it's only this. And so there is an error. Okay, makes sense? Now there is actually one thing that we can do, and that is optional parameters. So if you want to make this parameter optional, we just add a question mark to it, and now it is optional, so we no longer have to specify it. So just like this, and so now we only have 5, 23, and then Y is still here, but it's undefined because it's now optional. All right, but let's get rid of all of this because we only really need the ID, okay? And so now all we need to do is to actually get the tour with this ID from our data.json, from our JSON file, right? So basically from the tours array. And so that shouldn't be all too hard. And so let's say const tour is equals to tours.find. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with this find method here. So once more, this has nothing to do with Node or Express. It's just a regular JavaScript function which we can use on arrays. And the way it works is this. So in here, we pass a callback function. And so let me actually start by writing that one out. So element ID equals d rec.params. Okay, so it will basically loop through the array, and in each of the iterations, we will have access to the current element, and we will return either true or false in each of the iterations. Okay, now what the find method will then do is that basically it will create an array which only contains the element where this comparison here turned out to be true. Alright, and in this situation, we want to find the element where the ID is equal to the one that we get from the parameters. And so by specifying this callback function here with this comparison, we will ensure that only the element where the ID is actually equal to the specified ID in the parameters will get returned from the find method and stored into tour. Alright, now actually this is not going to work like this, because as you see down here, these values here, they are actually strings. Okay, so we need to convert that to a number, but that's very easy. All we have to do is to say the ID is equal to rec.params.id times 1. So this is a nice trick where JavaScript, when we multiply a string that looks like a number, when we multiply that with another number, it will then automatically convert that string to a number. So that's a very small, nice trick that we can use here. And so now we already have our tour ready to send. And so the data that we want to send is tours equal to tour. Or actually, it's just tour. So tour should be equal to tour. All right, makes sense? So maybe the most complicated part here is just this one. But yeah, that is again just the normal JavaScript. And so I believe, or at least I hope, that you're already familiar with using this kind of array methods. All right. So we only want tour number 5. And so let's take a look if it actually works. And well, it didn't. So let's take a look at that. Oh yeah, indeed. Here we need to use the ID, of course. So not rec.params. ID. Okay, so try that again. And now indeed we have the tour with ID of 5. Okay, and only that single tour. Let's try number 2, for example, and indeed ID 2. But now let's try another situation. Let's do ID 23. And so now we get nothing back, right? And that's because there is no tour with the ID of 23. But we still return the 200 OK status code. And so that doesn't make much sense, okay? And so let's actually go ahead and change that. And what should we do here? Well, as a very simplistic solution, what we can do is to check if the ID is larger than the length of the tours array. And if it is longer, well, then we can send back a 404 error saying that we could not find any tour for the given ID. So let's do that very simple solution because, well, this is not the real API that we're building at this point. And in this case, it's not a problem to use an overly simplistic solution like that because this is not the real thing that we're building here. We are really just trying to get familiar with the way that Express works. And the same thing can actually be said here. For example, so down here where we post a new tour, in the real world, we would always have to check if the user input is valid. So if it doesn't contain any malicious code or really anything that we don't want in our app. And again, we're going to do that, of course, later. But in this small example here, I really just want to focus on the fundamentals. Okay, so let's quickly implement what we were just saying, which is that if the ID is greater than tours.length, so for example, let's say we have 12 tours in our array, well, if the ID is then 13 or 15 or whatever, well, in that case, the ID is not valid. So we say return, and that's because we want to exit the function right at this point. Okay, and so that's why we say return. Then we send the status of 404 because we couldn't find any tour for that ID. And then a simple JSON response with the status of fail. So fail is what we send whenever we have a 400 code. And then just a message property invalid ID. All right, and so let's test that now. So we have our 23, and indeed 404 not found, invalid ID. So that's exactly what we just did, and it looks like it's working. Okay. Another solution that we could, of course, implement here as well would be to just do this test after we do the tour here. So we would get the ID, then we would try to find the tour, and if there was no tour, well, then we would say that the ID is invalid. So let's comment out this one, duplicate, just so that we actually keep both solutions here. And so we can say if there is no tour, okay, so basically the result here, if there is no tour found, well, that this variable here is basically undefined. And we can then test for that here like this. So if there's no tour, so if tour is basically undefined, well, then we send back this error message. So let's test that as well. And so indeed, it gives us the same result. Okay, and just like that, you learned how to specify parameters in a URL like this. Okay, then you learned how to read these parameters from the URL by using ret.params. Well, and then we used that ID, so that parameter, in order to find the tour with that exact ID. So that's what we did here in this line. Okay, so that was the goal for this video. And so let's now move on to the next one.